Have you ever been wronged so deeply, so quietly, so professionally that no one even knew it happened? No fight, no scene, just a decision made behind a closed door that cost you everything. Henrietta Rose Watkins knows exactly what that feels like. She lived with it for 38 years, and when the man responsible showed up at her gate, dying, asking for forgiveness, she did something nobody expected. Before we begin this incredible story, I ask you to leave a comment where you are watching me from and whether you have had similar stories in your life. Henrietta Rose Watkins was trimming the bougainvillea on her front porch when the car pulled up. She didn't look up right away. That was one of the things retirement had given her, the ability to finish what she started without somebody interrupting her. For 31 years at Coastal Gulf Energy, she had been interrupted, mid-sentence in meetings, mid-thought during presentations, mid-career, as it turned out. So now, at 69 years old, on a warm Tuesday morning in October in her own yard on Tier Wester Street in Houston's 3rd Ward, she finished clipping the branch she was clipping, set the shears down on the porch rail, and only then turned to look at the car. It was a silver Buick, clean but old. The kind of car a man keeps because he no longer has reason to impress anyone. She didn't recognize it. She watched it idle at her curb for a moment longer than felt natural. That particular hesitation of someone who has rehearsed, arriving somewhere and is losing their nerve at the last second. Then the engine cut off. The door opened slowly, and a man got out. He was tall, or had been once. Now he moved the way tall men do when their bodies have betrayed them, carefully, like he was negotiating with his own bones. He was white-haired, thin in a way that spoke of illness rather than fitness, and he was wearing a button-down shirt tucked into khaki trousers, the kind of careful dress a man puts on when he wants to be taken seriously despite everything. Henrietta knew him in the time it takes to draw one breath. She had not seen Gary Aldrich in 11 years. Not since the retirement party Coastal Gulf threw for him in 2015, which she had attended because her friend Delois had dared her to, and which she had left after exactly 40 minutes, having spoken to Gary for none of them. She watched him see her, watched the recognition move across his face, and behind it, something else. Something that looked from 30 feet away like relief. She picked her shears back up. "Henrietta," he called from the sidewalk. He didn't come through the gate. She noted that. He was waiting to be invited. "I'm sorry to come without calling. I wasn't sure I didn't have your number." "My number's in the same place it's always been," she said, and kept her eyes on the bougainvillea. "The city directory, same as my mother's number was and her mother's before that." A beat of silence. Would you have a few minutes?" Henrietta clipped one more branch, set the shears down again, folded her hands in front of her, the way her mother had taught her to stand when she needed to think without showing that she was thinking. "I have a pot of coffee on," she said finally. "You can come in." "But Gary," she looked at him directly then, for the first time. "I want you to hear this before you walk through my door. Whatever you came to say, I'm going to listen, but I am not going to perform anything for you. You understand what I mean by that?" He nodded. She wasn't sure he did, but she opened the gate anyway. "I'm going to tell you something about Henrietta Rose Watkins that she has never told anyone outside of this story. Not her daughter, not her pastor, not Delois, who has been her best friend for 44 years and thinks she knows everything about her. Just you. She had been waiting for this, not hoping for it, not praying for it, But somewhere in the back of that careful, organized mind, and the same mind that had graduated top of her class from Texas Southern University in 1978, that had passed every professional certification Coastal Gulf had required of her, and several they hadn't, that had spent 31 years being the smartest person in rooms that refused to acknowledge it. She had always known this conversation would come. She had just never decided what she would do with it. That was the thing nobody talks about when they talk about forgiveness. They talk about it like it's a destination, like there's a moment where you arrive, sign the papers, and everyone goes home. They don't talk about the preparation, the years of quiet decision-making that happen before the man with the silver Buick ever shows up at your gate. Henrietta had been preparing for 38 years. She just wasn't sure yet what she'd prepared for. The inside of Henrietta's house on Tierwester was the inside of a life fully inhabited. Bookshelves on every wall, history, theology, biography, a whole shelf of Black women writers that she'd been collecting since 1983, photographs in careful arrangements, her daughter Camille at her college graduation, her late husband Robert in his postal uniform, her mother and grandmother standing in front of this same house in a photograph from 1962, where the bougainvillea was just a thin climbing vine against new wood. Her mother had planted it. Henrietta had tended it. The vine was now older than most of the people on the block. She poured 2 cups of coffee without asking how he took his. He had spent enough years drinking her coffee at Coastal Gulf. She knew he took it black, the same way she did, one of the few things they had ever had in common. Gary sat at her kitchen table the way men sit when they know they're on someone else's territory, hands folded, back slightly too straight, eyes moving carefully around the room, taking in the details with the expression of a man who is realizing, perhaps for the first time, the full shape of the life he'd interrupted. "You have a beautiful home," he said. "I know," Henrietta said and sat down across from him. He almost smiled at that. Almost. She waited. She had learned to wait. It was, in fact, one of the great skills of her life, the ability to sit in silence and let the other person fill it. She had learned it in boardrooms where her presence made people uncomfortable. She had learned it from her mother, who could silence a whole Sunday dinner table with nothing but stillness. She had learned it from 38 years of carrying something heavy and choosing every single morning not to put it down in the wrong place. Gary Aldrich looked at his coffee, then at his hands, then finally at her. "I'm dying," he said. Henrietta said nothing. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, they gave me a range, best case maybe 6 months. She nodded slowly. Not with sympathy exactly. With acknowledgement, the way you nod when someone tells you something you already know somewhere deep in your body, the way you knew that car at the curb was his before you turned to look. "I'm sorry to hear that, Gary," she said, and she was. She searched herself for the feeling and found it small, uncomplicated, genuine. She was sorry. She wasn't glad. She had stopped wanting him to suffer years ago. That kind of wanting costs too much to maintain. "I came because I needed to." He stopped, reorganized. "I've been talking to my pastor and my kids and my doctor about there's a whole process they walk you through about things you need to address before." He stopped again. "I'm not saying this right." "You came to apologize," Henrietta said. He looked at her. "Yes. For 1987. Something moved across his face. "Among other things." Henrietta picked up her coffee, drank it slowly. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see the top of the bougainvillea she'd been trimming, its branches bright against the blue Houston sky. impervious and extravagant, and completely indifferent to what was happening inside this house. "Tell me something, Gary," she said, "before you say whatever you came to say. What do you think happened in 1987? The question seemed to startle him, like he'd rehearsed the apology but not the prerequisite of establishing the facts. I think you were passed over for a promotion that should have been yours. And I was given it instead. And I know, that the reasons weren't fair." "The reasons weren't fair," she repeated quietly. He heard it, the weight she put on those words. The 20-year-old weight of the word fair applied to something that had never been a matter of fairness at all. "I know that's insufficient," he said. "Do you?" she said, not harshly, just clearly. He was quiet. She looked at him, this man who had once walked into a room and received without effort, without asking, without even fully understanding the gift of it, everything she had worked a decade to earn. She looked at him and found that she felt neither hatred nor warmth. What she felt was something more particular than either, something she had spent years trying to name. She thought she might finally have a name for it. But we'll get to that. Stay with me. To understand what 1987 meant to Henrietta Watkins, you have to understand what 1977 felt like. That was the year she walked into the Coastal Gulf Energy offices on Louisiana Street in downtown Houston for her first interview. 22 years old, fresh from Texas Southern with a degree in economics and a minor in statistics, wearing the blue suit her mother had bought her at Foley's department store, and pressed the night before with the kind of careful reverence you reserve for things that matter. She had done her research. She knew Coastal Gulf's numbers better than some of their own analysts. She had prepared for every question they might ask, and several they didn't. What she had not prepared for was the look on the face of the man who interviewed her. Not hostility, not even coldness. Something almost worse. A benign bureaucratic surprise. The look of a man whose mental filing system had no category for what was standing in front of him, and who was therefore processing her as a curiosity rather than a candidate. She got the job anyway. She was that good. And she knew because her mother had told her, because her grandmother had told her mother, because this knowledge was passed down through black families in Houston like a particular kind of inheritance, that being that good was not sufficient. Being that good was the minimum requirement for being considered adequate. The bar for her was not the bar for everyone else. It had never been. It would never be. And the only dignified response to that fact was to clear it so cleanly, so repeatedly, and so without complaint that eventually the system itself would have to acknowledge what it was looking at. She believed that. For a long time, she truly believed it. Henrietta had grown up in this house on Tierwester Street, the second of 4 children born to Clarence and Viola Watkins. Her father drove a delivery truck for 30 years. Her mother taught 3rd grade at Yates Elementary for 28. They were not wealthy people, but they were what the 3rd Ward called solid. The kind of family that paid their bills on time, kept their yard, sat in the same pew every Sunday at Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, and never, under any circumstances, gave anyone in the neighborhood cause to speak poorly of them. Dignity, her mother used to say, is not what they give you. It's what you carry with you when they don't give you anything at all. Henrietta had carried it. Lord, had she carried it. She carried it through 11 years at Coastal Gulf, through every project she led that got credited to someone else, every meeting where she spoke and was not heard until a man repeated her point minutes later and was congratulated for it. She carried it through 3 rounds of promotion reviews in which she was told she was highly valued, a tremendous asset, essential to the team. All the words that mean we see you while meaning we will not move you. She carried it with grace, with professionalism, with the kind of quiet fury that has no outlet because the outlet would cost too much. And then came 1987. She was 32 years old. She had been at Coastal Gulf for a decade. She'd been running the regional data analysis division in everything but title for 2 years. Her supervisor, a well-meaning but largely decorative man named Phil Bro, had said himself in her annual review that the division's performance under her direction had been exemplary, that her grasp of the financial modeling was unmatched on the team, and that she was exactly the kind of talent the company needed to develop. The senior analyst position opened up in March. Phil told her privately, over bad coffee in the break room, dropping his voice the way people do when they're trying to be kind while being cowardly, that her application was exactly what they were looking for, and that he had put her name forward personally. She applied. She interviewed. She waited. Gary Aldrich had been at Coastal Gulf for 4 years. He had come from a smaller firm in Dallas, was competent, in the way that many competent men are competent, reliably, inoffensively, without brilliance, and had a handshake that people seemed to find reassuring. He interviewed 2 weeks after Henrietta did. He got the job. Have you ever received news that you already knew was coming, that you had, in fact, been bracing for your entire adult life, and still been surprised by how much it hurt? Not because it was unexpected, but because somewhere underneath all the preparation, all the strategic stoicism, all the dignified armor, there was still a small place inside you that had believed it might be different this time. Henrietta sat in Phil Bro's office on a Wednesday afternoon in April 1987 and listened to him explain the decision using words like experience matrix and team chemistry and long-term fit, and she watched him not meet her eyes, and she understood every single thing that was happening. And she felt that small place inside her go very, very quiet. She thanked him for his time. She went back to her desk. She did not cry until she was in her car in the parking garage, and then she allowed herself exactly 7 minutes. She had checked her watch before she wiped her face, started the engine, and drove home. She never mentioned it at work, not once, not to Phil, not to her colleagues, not to the HR woman who had called her to deliver the news and who had said, with almost heroic obliviousness, "We really hope you'll continue to be a valuable part of the team." She continued to be a valuable part of the team for another 20 years. She got her promotion eventually, 2 years later, under a different supervisor, almost as if the organization had decided that enough time had passed to launder the original injustice. By then, she had learned something important. The victory felt almost nothing like she had imagined it would. Because by then she knew that what had been taken from her in 1987 was not just a title or a salary. It was something that couldn't be given back by a belated promotion or a plaque on the wall. It was the version of herself she would have become if the decision had been made correctly. That version was gone. You can't recover a path you didn't take. You can only walk the one you're on, as well as you know how, and try not to look back too often at the fork. Henrietta had tried. Most days she had succeeded, but some days, some gray Houston mornings when the coffee tasted like 1987 and the weight was back before she'd even gotten out of bed, some days the fork was all she could see. Gary was still sitting at her kitchen table. She had been quiet for a while, long enough that he'd shifted in his chair twice. She recognized the discomfort of a man who was accustomed to controlling rooms through energy and volume, now sitting in a room that he couldn't control, next to a woman who had stopped performing patients for other people's comfort sometime around 2011. "You want more coffee?" she asked. "I'm fine, thank you." "How long do you have?" "In Houston, I mean. Are you driving back today?" "I'm staying at my son's place in Katy. I'm flexible." She nodded. "Then we're not in a hurry." She got up and refilled her own cup, even though it didn't need refilling. Sometimes you need to move your body to organize your thoughts. At the window, looking out at the bougainvillea, she thought about her mother. Viola Watkins had died in this house in 2009 in the back bedroom, with Henrietta's hand in hers and a gospel song moving softly from the radio on the nightstand. In her last coherent weeks, her mother had said something that Henrietta had turned over and over in her mind ever since. "Henny," her mother had said, "you have spent your whole life being right. Make sure that doesn't keep you from being free." She hadn't understood it then. She thought she was beginning to understand it now. But understanding something, she reminded herself, turning back to the table, is not the same as owing someone something because you understand it. Whatever was coming next, she was going to get to choose it. That was the one thing Gary Aldrich was not going to take from her today. The Third Ward had been watching Henrietta Watkins's house since before Henrietta Watkins was born. That is not an exaggeration. The house on Tierwester had been in the family since 1951, when Henrietta's grandfather, a man named August Watkins, who had come up from Louisiana in the second wave of the Great Migration, had purchased it. Paid cash, actually, because the banks were not especially enthusiastic about lending to men who look like August Watkins. So he had saved for 11 years and bought it outright, which was a fact that Henrietta's family had repeated with quiet ferocity at every gathering for 70 years since. "We own it free and clear," her grandfather used to say. "Nobody can put us out." That sentence had become a kind of family scripture. Nobody can put us out. It meant the house. It meant, over time, something larger than the house. The Third Ward had changed around the house the way neighborhoods do. Some things lost, some things transformed, new people arriving, old families holding on or letting go or being slowly squeezed out by pressures that didn't announce themselves as hostile, but performed hostility nonetheless. Henrietta had watched the changes with the eyes of someone who had lived here continuously, and therefore saw each shift not as a sudden rupture, but as the latest chapter of a very long story. She knew her neighbors, not the performative knowing of someone who waves from the driveway, but the deep, accumulated knowing of shared decades. She knew that Miss Eula next door still put a plate on the porch on Sunday afternoons for whoever might need it, a practice she'd maintained since the 1970s. She knew that the Tran family 3 doors down had lived here nearly as long as she had, that their mother had tended a kitchen garden that was now tended by their daughter, that the rhythms of one family's life had braided quietly into the rhythms of another's, in the way that only happens when people stay. She knew who on this block had buried a child, who had come back from something and who hadn't, who was holding on to a house that needed more repairs than they could afford, because the house was the last thing they had left of someone they'd loved. This neighborhood had held Henrietta through everything. Through the year Robert died, 2014, a Tuesday, the same day of the week as today, which she hadn't thought about until just now. Through Camille's years of difficulty and then Camille's years of grace. Through the retirement that had felt, at first, like being set adrift, and then gradually, slowly, like being handed back something she'd been paying into for a very long time. Delois had said, the week after Henrietta cleared out her desk at Coastal Gulf for the last time, "Henny, you know what you did?" You endured, and endurance is not nothing. Don't let anybody tell you it's nothing. I know it's not nothing, Henrietta had said, but she had thought about it. But I'm tired of endurance being the thing I'm best at. Delois had been quiet a moment, then decide what you want to be best at now. You got time. What Henrietta had decided to be best at in the 5 years since retirement was presence. Full, deliberate, unhurried presence in her own life, or in her garden, in her kitchen, in her reading chair in the evening with a glass of sweet tea and a book she chose for pleasure rather than utility. In her relationship with Camille, which had required rebuilding after years of both of them being too busy and too guarded to say the things that needed saying. In her church, Wheeler Avenue Baptist, where she sang in the choir on the third Sunday of the month and sat on the hospitality committee, and had recently, somewhat to her own surprise, agreed to lead a monthly Bible study for women over 60, she had not been best at bitterness. She wanted to be clear about that, to herself, to you. She had carried the anger. She would not dishonor it by pretending she hadn't, but she had not let it be the organizing principle of her days. There was a difference between carrying something and being defined by it. She understood that difference. She had worked for it. But here was the thing she had never fully resolved. The thing that sat quiet and persistent in the back of her mind like a sound you can't quite identify. She had never been asked. In 38 years, no one from Coastal Gulf had ever said, "We see what happened. We see what we did. We're sorry." The promotion that came 2 years later had been presented as a merit decision, not a correction. The retirement party in 2019 had been warm and genuine and had said nothing about what had been taken. The plaques and the handshakes and the kind words had all been real. She believed they were real, and none of them had named the thing. And now Gary Aldrich was in her kitchen, naming the thing. And she found herself in a position she had not anticipated. She wasn't sure the naming was for her. She wasn't sure she was the intended beneficiary of this visit at all. There were 3 things Henrietta needed to figure out before Gary Aldrich left her house today. The first was what he actually wanted. The second was what she actually wanted. And the third was whether those 2 things had anything to do with each other. We'll come back to all 3. From the kitchen, she could hear Gary shift his chair. She had been standing at the window too long, she realized. Long enough for the silence to become something he was sitting inside of, trying to interpret. She came back to the table, sat down. "Tell me about your kids," she said. He blinked. Whatever he'd been expecting her to say, it wasn't that. I have 3. Melissa, who lives in Austin, Ryan, who I'm staying with, and Katie, and Tom, who's out in Colorado. They good kids? They are, yeah. Something softened in his face. Melissa. She's a lot like you, actually. The way she works, doesn't let anything slide. Henrietta looked at him steadily. "Don't do that, Gary." He stopped. "Do what?" "Compare your daughter to me like it's a compliment to one of us. It's complicated, and you know why." He closed his eyes briefly. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." "That's the 3rd time you've said sorry in 30 minutes, Henrietta said, "and we haven't even gotten to 1987 yet." He almost laughed, caught himself. Outside, the number 82 bus went by on Tierwester. A dog somewhere down the street started and then stopped barking, the ordinary music of a Tuesday morning going about its business, indifferent to what was happening at this kitchen table. "Why don't you start from the beginning?" Henrietta said. "Tell me what you think the beginning is, and then I'll tell you whether we agree." Gary Aldrich looked at her. This woman in her green linen shirt in her mother's kitchen with her grandfather's house around her and her silver locks and her hands flat on the table, calm as weather. He looked at her the way people look at something when they're finally letting themselves see it clearly. And Henrietta Rose Watkins, who had been waiting 38 years for this conversation without ever admitting that she was waiting, sat back in her chair. She was ready. But not for what he was about to say. Gary Aldrich had not told the whole truth to his pastor. He had told the version of the truth that made the story manageable, the version where he was a man who had, by the structural inequities of his era, benefited from a system he hadn't designed. Went. It did not go far enough. And went. It did not go far enough. And Henrietta, who had been watching people narrate themselves for 69 years, could hear the place where the version stopped. I knew, Gary said. He had been talking for 12 minutes. He had described 1987 the way he had clearly described it many times, measured, remorseful in tone, careful in structure, and then in the middle of a sentence, as if the sentence itself had gotten tired of carrying the lighter version and put it down, he said, I knew. Henrietta was very still. I knew before the decision was made, he said. His voice had changed. It was lower now, slower. The rehearsed quality was gone. Phil came to me. Before he talked to either of us formally, he asked me, he said, Gary, if this goes the way I think it's going to go, are you comfortable with that? And I said, yes. The kitchen was very quiet. I could have said no, Gary said. I could have told him that wasn't right. I knew your work. Everybody knew your work. I knew it was your job, and I said yes anyway. Henrietta looked at the window, at the bougainvillea, very bright. Because you wanted it, she said. Because I wanted it. He said it plainly without trying to dress it up. Because I had a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage and I wanted it. And I know this doesn't make it better. Because I told myself that the system would correct. That you'd get the next one. That it wasn't. That one, yes, from me wasn't the whole. It was the whole thing, Henrietta said quietly. Phil needed cover. He needed one person in the room to say yes. You were the one person he asked. Gary said nothing. He asked you because he knew you'd say yes, she continued. He didn't ask because he was uncertain. He asked because he needed a witness. The word landed between them. Witness. Gary's jaw tightened, then released. Yes, he said, that's right. Now, here is what Henrietta felt in that moment, and I am going to ask you to stay with her in it, because it matters, and because it is more complicated than the story would be easier if it were. She felt vindicated. The word comes first, so let it be first. After 38 years of carrying something that had no official record, no acknowledgement, no document that said, yes, this happened, yes, it was unjust, to have the man himself sit in her kitchen and say, I knew, I was asked, I said yes, that was something. That was not nothing. Her body registered it the way it registers cold water on a hot day. Involuntary, immediate, physical. But underneath the vindication, or beside it, or threaded through it, she couldn't quite locate the geometry, was something else. Something that felt less like relief and more like the particular sadness of a proof that arrives too late to change the equation it proves. She had been right. She had always known she was right, and here was the confirmation, 38 years later, from a dying man in her kitchen on a Tuesday in October. She had been right, and being right had not given her back the woman she would have been. That, she realized, was the thing her mother had been trying to tell her. Not that she should forgive, not that she should let go, but that being right, holding the rightness close, polishing it, organizing her interior life around the proof of it, was its own kind of cage. Not because the anger wasn't legitimate, it was entirely legitimate, but because she had been living for 38 years in a room defined by someone else's crime, and the room was hers. Her mind, her memory, her life. And perhaps it was time to decide what she wanted to do with it now. Perhaps, she wasn't sure yet. She was 69 years old and she had earned the right to not be sure. Gary was watching her. She realized she had been quiet for a long time. "What do you want from me, Gary?" she asked, straight, clean, without hostility but without softness. He looked down at his hands. "I want you to know that I know what I did. I want that to be said out loud between us before I—" He stopped. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I understand if you can't. I just needed you to know that I know." Henrietta studied him. She believed him. She thought that was the truthful thing. She believed that this was what he'd come for, that the wanting was genuine, that the dying had stripped away whatever capacity he'd once had for self-protective narration. But she also noticed something. I needed, before I... Every sentence organized around him, every sentence describing what this visit would give him, the knowing acknowledged, the dying eased. The ledger, his ledger, brought slightly more toward balance. Her ledger was not mentioned. Her ledger was assumed to be a thing that his wanting could address. She wasn't angry about it. She was just observing it, filing it carefully in the part of her mind that had spent 31 years at Coastal Gulf learning to read what sentences were actually about. "I hear you," she said. "Is there anything—" He hesitated. "Is there anything you want to say to me?" She thought about it seriously, gave it the weight it deserved. "Not yet," she said. He nodded, seemed to accept it. Can I come back? Would that be—" "You can come back Thursday," she said. 2:00. We'll sit on the porch if the weather holds." He looked briefly like a man who had been given something he hadn't dared ask for. She watched him try to contain it, the relief, the gratitude, and she noted that she felt neither pleasure nor discomfort at his relief. She felt very precisely like herself. That was something, she thought. That was, in fact, quite a lot. After she walked him to the gate, she didn't walk him to his car, she walked him to the gate and watched him walk the rest himself. She stood on her porch for a long time. The number 82 came by again. Miss Eula's wind chimes turned slowly. The bougainvillea moved in a small southerly breeze. Henrietta thought, "He came here to receive something," she thought, "and I am going to decide whether I give it to him." She thought, and for the first time in 38 years, the decision is entirely mine. That thought arrived quietly, without drama, the way the most important things tend to arrive. She picked up her shears from the porch rail where she'd left them. She went back to work on the bougainvillea, but somewhere in the back of that careful mind, a question had taken up residence. Quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. Not, can she forgive him? That was his question, organized around his need. Her question was different, older, and she was finally, at 69 years old, ready to answer it honestly. "We'll get there. Stay with me." He was punctual. She had expected that. Gary Aldrich had always been punctual. One of those men whose reliability in small things made you trust them in large things before you'd earned the right to. She remembered that about him from Coastal Gulf. 9:00 meeting. Gary was there at 8:55, which meant that his unreliability in the things that actually mattered had always been a particular kind of betrayal. The betrayal of someone who performs trustworthiness so consistently that you stop checking whether it's real. He came through the gate at 1:58. She was already on the porch. 2 glasses of sweet tea on the small table between the chairs, the bougainvillea above them throwing dappled shade across the floorboards. The afternoon was warm for October. Houston's seasons had always moved on their own schedule, indifferent to the calendar. She watched him come up the porch steps. He moved better today than Tuesday, she thought, or maybe he was simply less afraid. "You look rested," she said. "I slept," he said, "first time in a while." He sat in the chair she indicated, looked at the sweet tea. "Thank you. Drink it slow. It's strong." For a few minutes, they sat in something that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, the particular register of 2 people who know each other's worst truths and are deciding how to be in the same space with that knowledge. Down the street, somebody's grandchildren were playing, their voices carrying in the warm air. Miss Eula's wind chimes, the distant familiar groan of the number 82. "I've been thinking," Gary said, "I imagine so. About what you said Tuesday, about Phil needing a witness." He turned his glass slowly in his hands. "I've been thinking about that word all week, witness, because it's exactly right, and I never let myself name it that way. I always called it, in my head when I thought about it, I called it going along, like it was passive, like I just stood there while something happened." "But you weren't passive," Henrietta said. "No, I was the mechanism." She looked at him. "That's a precise word." "I've had a lot of time to find precise words lately." A pause. "Terminal diagnosis has a way of burning off the comfortable ones." She nodded slowly. "The honest ones," she had found, came for you eventually regardless. The diagnosis just moved up the timeline. She thought about Robert in his last months, how he had said things she'd waited 30 years to hear, not because he hadn't felt them, but because the ordinary busyness of living had always seemed to crowd them out. Dying was clarifying. She understood that. She wasn't sure it was a transaction she was willing to honor just because it was clarifying. "There's something else," Gary said. He said it the way someone says the thing they came to say after 20 minutes of saying the thing they came to say first, to see if the ground was solid enough to hold the real weight. Henrietta set down her tea. "Tell me." He looked out at the street, at the bougainvillea, at his hands, then at her. "It wasn't the only time," he said. The wind chimes moved. A child laughed far away. "What do you mean?" she said, not a question. A space she was holding open for him to fill. 1987 that was the first time. But in 1992, there was a departmental restructuring. Director of analysis position. You applied. You were the obvious candidate. Phil was gone by then. It was a man named Hutchins running it. Gary's jaw worked. "Hutchins asked me to write a character assessment, an informal one, not part of the official process, just between colleagues," he said. Henrietta was very still. "I wrote it," Gary said. I wrote that you were technically excellent, but that you had, I used the phrase, difficulty with collaborative leadership, which was not true. I knew it was not true, and I wrote it anyway." The porch was quiet. In 1992, Henrietta had not gotten the director of analysis position. She had been told by Hutchins that it had been a very competitive process. She had believed him. She had gone back to her desk and worked harder and waited for the next opportunity, and not cried in the parking garage this time because by 1992, she had already learned that the parking garage was a finite resource, and she needed to preserve it. She had spent 33 years not knowing about the character assessment. "How many times?" she said. Her voice was level. She was surprised by how level it was. Inside, something had shifted. Not broken, not collapsed, but shifted, the way ground shifts before you hear the sound of it. Gary closed his eyes. Twice. Just those 2 times. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She stood up, walked to the porch rail, stood with her back to him, looking at Tierwester Street, at the neighborhood her grandfather had paid cash for because nobody would loan him the money, at the ordinary Thursday afternoon going about its business around a conversation that was quietly rearranging the architecture of her past. 1987. She had known about, she had built around it. The way you build around a structural wound, reinforcing the walls nearest to it, redirecting the load. 1992 she had not known about. 1992 was new damage, and new damage, arriving 33 years late, had a particular quality. It didn't feel like old pain reopening. It felt like a room in her own house that she had never been inside, that had been there the whole time, that contained something she now had to decide what to do with. There were, she realized, more years like 1992 she might not know about. She could ask. He would tell her. She stood at the porch rail and asked herself whether she wanted to know. She didn't yet know the answer, but by the end of this afternoon she would. "Stay with me." She stayed at the porch rail for a long time. Gary did not try to fill the silence. She respected that, or noted it at least, as a change from the man she remembered. The Gary Aldrich of Coastal Gulf meetings had been a man constitutionally uncomfortable with silence, who filled it reflexively with confident-sounding words, whether or not the confidence or the words were warranted. This Gary had learned to wait. Dying will do that, she supposed. It teaches you that silence is not a problem to solve. She turned back and sat down. "I have a question," she said, "and I want you to answer it without softening it. Can you do that?" "I'll try." "Don't try. Do it." He nodded. "When you wrote that assessment in 1992, the one about collaborative leadership, did you believe that would end my candidacy, or did you just think it would slow me down?" He looked at her steadily. "I thought it would end it." "And was that the intent?" A long pause. "Yes." She nodded. "Thank you." He seemed confused by the thank you. She understood the confusion, but she meant it precisely. She was thanking him for the accuracy, not the action. There was a difference. Here was the question she was actually building toward, the one that had been forming in her since Tuesday, that had kept its shape through 2 sleepless stretches of the night, that had clarified during her Bible study Wednesday morning when she was supposed to be discussing Psalm 37 and instead found herself doing arithmetic. "Gary, what is your youngest child's age?" He blinked. "Tom, he just turned 40. "And what year did you retire?" 2015. "At what level?" "I was Senior Director of Regional Analysis." She picked up her tea, set it down. "If I had gotten the director position in 1992 and continued on the trajectory that position would have opened, not accounting for anything exceptional, just the standard path, where would I have been when I retired in 2019? He was quiet for a moment, then, slowly. "Senior Director, possibly VP level." "At what salary differential?" He looked at her. She could see him doing the math she had already done. Late Tuesday night at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen that had been Robert's, working through the numbers with the same methodical precision that had made her, in Phil Bro's own words, unmatched on the team. Henrietta. Answer the question. Over the full career, he stopped, started again, somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 in cumulative salary differential, not counting pension impact. The number sat on the porch between them like an object. Neither of them looked directly at it. That's not why I asked, she said. I know. I asked because I wanted you to say it out loud. Because it is very easy to come to someone's porch and say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I knew what I was doing, and those words are real, and I believe them. But there is a version of an apology that performs guilt without accounting for consequence. And I have spent my entire professional life watching men perform guilt about structural harm without ever looking at the structure. Gary was listening with his whole body. She had never seen him listen like that. At Coastal Gulf, he had listened the way men listen in meetings, which is partially and strategically, with the remaining processing power directed toward formulating the response. This was different. This was the listening of a man who had run out of responses. The consequence, she continued, is not primarily financial. I have a house that is paid for, a pension that is sufficient, a daughter I am proud of, and a life that I have built with my own hands and my own choices. The consequence is not that I am poor. The consequence is that I made those choices inside a container that was smaller than the one I was entitled to. And every choice I made, everything I became, was shaped by the dimensions of that container. You don't get to measure the consequence. Neither do I, fully. You can't count what was never allowed to exist. Gary said nothing for a long time. Then, I know that. Do you understand that an apology doesn't resize the container retroactively? Yes. And do you understand that I am not asking you to do the impossible? I am not asking you to give back 38 years. I am asking you to understand what you are actually asking me for. He looked at her. What am I asking you for? She leaned back in her chair. The bougainvillea moved above them. A cloud crossed the sun and the porch went temporarily cooler. You're asking me to release you, she said. That's what forgiveness is structurally. You're asking me to perform an act of grace that will ease your passage through your remaining time, and I want to be honest with you. That is not inherently wrong. It may even be a good thing for you, but I need you to understand that it is a transaction that primarily benefits you. And the question I've been sitting with since Tuesday is whether I owe you that transaction. Gary was very still. And what did you decide? Henrietta looked at the street, at Miss Eula's house, at the bougainvillea her mother planted in 1974. I haven't decided yet, she said, but I'm going to tell you a story. And then I will. You think you know where this is going? I promise you, you don't. Not yet. I'm going to tell you something now that Henrietta Rose Watkins has never told another living soul. Not Delois, not Camille, not the pastor at Wheeler Avenue who has known her for 30 years. Just you. Because you have earned it. You have stayed with her this far. And because this is the part that changes everything. In 1987, the same spring she did not get the promotion, Henrietta had been approached by a woman named Dr. Patricia Okafor. Dr. Okafor was a professor at Texas Southern, Henrietta's alma mater, who was building an economics research center and was quietly recruiting talent from the private sector to join as fellows and eventually faculty. She had read a paper Henrietta had authored internally at Coastal Gulf, an analysis of Gulf Coast energy pricing models that had circulated beyond the company's walls through a colleague, and she had called Henrietta directly. "You are wasted there," Dr. Okafor had said with the directness of someone who did not believe in softening useful truths. "I have read your work. I know what you are capable of. Come build something that belongs to you." The fellowship would have paid 60% of her Coastal Gulf salary. It would have led, Dr. Okafor believed, to a tenured faculty position within 4 to 5 years. It would have been, as best as Henrietta could calculate looking back, an extraordinary life, different from the one she'd had, smaller in some material ways, larger in nearly every other. Henrietta had thought about it for 6 weeks, and then she had said no. She had said no because she was 32 years old and had a mortgage and a husband whose postal route had just been reduced, and a conviction, fierce, principled, and, she now understood, slightly naive, that she was not going to let them push her out. She was not going to give Coastal Gulf the satisfaction of her departure. She was going to stay, and she was going to rise, and she was going to do it inside the system that had wronged her, because leaving felt like losing, and she was not prepared to lose. That was what she had told herself. But here in this porch story she had never told anyone, was the other part. The part she had only admitted to herself in the last few years, in the quiet of her reading chair, with the kind of honesty that only becomes possible when you are old enough to stop protecting your past self from your current understanding. She had also said no because she was afraid, not of failure, not of the pay cut, but of something harder to name, the fear of stepping out of the container she'd been fighting inside of and discovering that she didn't know who she was outside it. She had spent a decade at Coastal Gulf building an identity out of resistance, resistant to dismissal, to condescension, to the low ceiling. Her competence had been forged in opposition. She was excellent in spite of. And Dr. Okafor was offering her a world where the opposition was removed, where she could simply be excellent, full stop, without the friction that had become the medium she moved through. She had not known how to imagine herself in that world. So she had stayed. And she had risen eventually, in the way that belated, insufficient, structurally compromised rising looks like. And she had had a life, a real life, a good life, in the ways that matter. And she had never called Dr. Okafor back. Dr. Okafor had gone on to found one of the most cited economics research centers in the South. She had retired 4 years ago with a named chair and a legacy that Henrietta followed quietly from a distance, the way you follow the life you didn't choose, with a mixture of admiration and something that was too old and too refined to be called regret, but was related to it. Now, here is why she was telling Gary Aldrich this story. Not to assign him additional blame for the 1987 decision that had made Coastal Gulf feel like the only option. Not to expand the ledger. She had thought about that framing and rejected it. It was too clean, too satisfying, and satisfaction was what she was trying to move past. She was telling him because of what she had realized at 2 a.m. on Wednesday while writing numbers on Robert's yellow legal pad. The decision not to call Dr. Okafor back was hers, made in fear, made in pride, made in the very particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided that leaving was losing, but made at the end of the accounting by her, not by Phil Bro, not by Gary Aldrich, not by the system which had certainly created the conditions but had not held the phone. She had stayed because she chose to stay. And for 38 years she had told herself, quietly, without quite using the words, but in the shape of how she organized her memory, that she had stayed because they had made her stay, that the container was their creation entirely, and it was their creation, largely, substantially, unjustly. She was not releasing them from that, but she had also built walls of her own, out of pride, out of fear, out of the understandable but ultimately limiting decision to define herself entirely in opposition to the people who had wronged her. And that, not the promotions, not the salary differential, not Gary's character assessment, that was the thing she needed to look at directly before she decided what to do with the man sitting across from her on her mother's porch. She finished the story. Gary was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" he said finally. "Because," she said, "I spent 38 years being angry at the right people for the right reasons. And I have recently been considering the possibility that I also owe myself an honest accounting. And I thought, if I'm going to do that accounting, I might as well do it out loud in front of someone who contributed to the original conditions. A witness," he said quietly, using her own word. "A witness," she agreed. He looked at her with an expression she had no precedent for. Not from him, not from anyone. It was something past admiration, something past guilt. It was the look of a man in the presence of a quality he could identify but had never possessed, and now would not have time to develop. "Henrietta," he said, "I don't deserve to be in that role for you." "No," she said, "you don't. But here you are." A pause. "And I'm choosing to use you anyway, because I spent 31 years at Coastal Gulf making productive use of insufficient materials. Old habit." He almost laughed. This time she let him. And in that almost laugh, brief and complicated and carrying the weight of everything that had passed between them, something shifted on the porch. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Something more structural than both. A small, precise rearrangement of what this conversation was for and who it belonged to. The kettle had been building for 38 years, and it was finally about to declare itself. Gary left at 4:47. She walked him to the gate again. He extended his hand, not the corporate handshake, but something less practiced, more uncertain, the offering of a man who doesn't know what gesture is appropriate and is trying to let her choose. She looked at his hand for a moment, then she shook it. Brief, clean, without warmth and without coldness, the handshake of a woman concluding a meeting on her own terms. "Thank you," he said, for both days." She nodded. "I hope—" He stopped. "I hope the rest of your life is—" "I hope it's everything." She looked at him. "It already is," she said, and meant it. She watched him walk to his car. He moved a little more carefully than he had coming up. The weight of the afternoon, of both afternoons, was visible in his walk. She did not find satisfaction in that. She found examining herself honestly something closer to compassion, small, uncomplicated, and entirely compatible with everything else she felt about him. She closed the gate. She did not watch him drive away. She went inside and stood in her kitchen for a long time. The late afternoon light was doing what it does in October in Houston, going golden, then amber, then a deep warm orange that made the kitchen walls look like they were lit from inside. Her mother had loved this light, had called it the Lord's last word of the day. Henrietta poured herself a glass of water, stood at the sink. She took an inventory. Item: Gary Aldrich had taken something from her in 1987 that could not be returned. Item: he had compounded that taking in 1992 knowingly and with intent. Item: he had come 33 years after the second taking and 38 after the first to tell her that he knew. Item: he was dying. Item: he had wanted her forgiveness. And then the harder items, the ones below the line. Item: she had also made a choice in 1987 that was hers. Item, she had let the wound organize her interior life for longer than it had to. Item, she had built something good inside the container. Not despite the container, but also not only because of it. Item, she was 69 years old and she was healthy, and the bougainvillea needed one more good pruning before winter, and Camille was coming for Thanksgiving, and her choir had a concert the third Sunday of November, and her Bible study women were going to need a proper discussion guide for the book of Ruth, and there was a tremendous amount of living left to do. Had she forgiven him? She stood at the sink in the amber light and asked herself the question directly, the way she had learned to ask herself things directly, without performance, without the answer she was supposed to give, without the answer that would make her look either nobly magnanimous or righteously implacable. The honest answer was, she didn't know. And she had decided, sometime during the second glass of sweet tea on the porch, that she was not going to force the answer. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she had spent her entire life being asked to resolve things on other people's timelines, to decide, to react, to confirm or deny, to perform closure so that someone else could have comfort. She was not going to do that. What she had decided was this: she was no longer going to let Gary Aldrich's crime be the load-bearing wall of her memory. Not because he had earned that release, not because he had apologized beautifully or confessed completely or offered anything commensurate with the taking, but because the load-bearing wall of her memory was hers, and she intended to decide what it was made of. She wanted it made of her grandfather paying cash for this house. She wanted it made of her mother's hands pressing the blue suit the night before the interview. She wanted it made of Dr. Patricia Okafor saying, "You are wasted there," and of the fact that Henrietta now understood that sentence not as a permanent condition, but as an observation that had been, in the end, proved wrong. She had not been wasted. She had been constrained. There was a difference. She had built something real inside the constraint. It was not the largest possible version of her life, but it was hers fully and entirely, in every way that a life can be a person's own. She wanted the load-bearing wall to be the woman she had become despite everything and because of herself. Gary Aldrich could keep his guilt. He was going to need it in whatever accounting came next. The one she didn't govern. She was not his confessor. She was not his priest. She was not the instrument of his peace. She was Henrietta Rose Watkins. Her grandfather had paid cash for this ground. Her mother had planted the bougainvillea. She had tended it for 45 years, and it was extravagant and impervious and entirely magnificent. And tomorrow morning she would come out in the early light and give it the last pruning of the season, and the year after that she would do it again, and the year after that, God willing, she would do it again. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. She called Delois at 5:15. "Chile," Delois said before Henrietta had finished the second sentence. "Chile, Chile, Chile." I know. That man had the nerve. He did. "And you sat with him twice?" "I did." "Henny." A pause. The particular pause of someone who has been your best friend for 44 years and is trying to figure out how you are without asking you directly, because you have never been the kind of woman who answers direct questions about your interior state without thinking about it first. "How do you feel?" Henrietta looked out the kitchen window. The bougainvillea was going dark in the last of the light. The number 82 made its final pass of the afternoon. "Free," she said, "not healed, not resolved. Not at peace in the way church people mean peace, the tranquil, arrived at kind that implies the journey is complete. just free. Decided that she is the author of what decided that she is the author of what comes next. Well, Delois said softly. Well. Yeah, Henrietta said. They stayed on the phone for another hour talking about Camille and the choir concert and a recipe Delois had ruined twice and was determined to try a third time. The ordinary, irreplaceable music of two women who have known each other long enough to let the important things settle without commentary. After she hung up, Henrietta sat in her reading chair with her Bible open to Psalm 37, the one she'd been distracted from at Wednesday's study group. She read the verse she hadn't gotten to on Wednesday. The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. She had always heard that verse as a promise. Tonight she heard it as something else, a description of how a life is built. Not in the grand gestures, not in the loud vindications, in the steps, ordered, deliberate, one at a time through whatever ground you happen to be walking on. She had walked on difficult ground. She had not stumbled. That, she thought, was the thing Gary Aldrich could never have taken from her, no matter what he wrote in any assessment, the thing none of them had ever been able to touch. Not Phil Bro, not Hutchins, not the entire architecture of a system designed to redirect her. They could constrain the container. They could not constrain what she built inside it. She closed the Bible, put on her reading glasses, picked up the book she'd started last week, a biography of Shirley Chisholm she'd been looking forward to for months. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening sounds. The children had gone in. The wind chimes were still. The bougainvillea stood in the dark, patient and flowering and absolutely, permanently rooted in her grandfather's ground. She read until 10 o'clock. She slept without interruption. For the first time in 38 years, she did not dream about 1987. 6 months later, Delois told her that Gary Aldrich had died. Peacefully, his son had written in the obituary, at home, surrounded by family. Henrietta read the obituary once, folded the paper, put it in the recycling. Then she went out to the porch to check on the bougainvillea. It was spring. It was blooming. It did not need her. It never had. It just needed the ground, and the light, and enough time. She gave it all three.